My talk is about using critical zone observations to improve groundwater recharge modeling. And I thought, as not many of you, or not all of you are hydrologists, just begin with a very simple question: why should we model groundwater recharge at all? And one important reason that I always write in my papers is that groundwater recharge is a very important number to be used in sustainable water management. So I cannot take out more from an aquifer than it receives in the long term, otherwise I will deplete my groundwater resources. Also, those who work with groundwater recharge, they may know that it's really hard to get observations of groundwater recharge over time and over space. And those who work with models, they might also know that the questions that we always get as hydrogeologists or hydrologists is: how will groundwater recharge change in the future? So is the water volume that I extract from an aquifer in a sustainable way also sustainable in the future, considering climate or land use change? And of course, as we are at a critical zone meeting, most processes that control groundwater recharge actually take place in the critical zone. So that was quite general. Why should someone model karstic recharge? There are some very important points that actually give some purpose to that. One of them is that almost a quarter of Europe is covered by carbonate rocks that, if they are exposed to the atmosphere, could potentially karstify. Also, around a third of its population is living in those regions, so it's disproportionately more. Considering different countries, including France, we see that many countries have quite a substantial fraction of carbonate rock outcrops in their land area, and also quite a lot of countries receive a large fraction of their total water supply from carbonate rock regions. My famous example is unfortunately not France, it's Austria, which is mostly dominated by the city of Vienna, which completely receives its water from a karst aquifer, and Vienna is almost half of the population of Austria. Globally, around a quarter of the population is completely or partially dependent on karst water resources. So it's really important to quantify the volumes that we can extract from karst aquifers sustainably. In the next slides, more or less the first half of the talk, I will provide a little summary of what I did to do a quantification of groundwater recharge at a quite large scale, which is the scale, same scale as in the same previous figure, the scale of entire Europe and a bit of Northern Africa and the Middle East. As you can imagine, there are not a lot of measurements available at that scale. And those that I found and used for my groundwater recharge simulation, actually shown here by the green and orange points. These are FluxNet stations. They measure latent heat flux, among others. So it's estimate of actual evapotranspiration. And the ISMN stations are stations of the International Soil Moisture Network, which measure soil moisture, as the name indicates. And I only picked those who are located within the karst or carbonate rock regions. Apart from the measurements, of course, it's necessary to have some sort of model. Also, at this large scale, it's quite difficult to come up with a site-specific model structure as hydrogeologists would develop when working on a catchment scale. In this case, I had to rather rely on conceptual understanding of how the karst critical zone works. This is one of the many conceptual figures or sketches that are available in different publications. I took this because it's from my PhD student, Romane Berthelin, and it's the most recent one, and I think it's very nice because it has a little flower. But anyway, it shows how carbonate rock recharge takes place. It shows that you can have actual evapotranspiration, you have a heterogeneity of soil thicknesses, you have small cracks and fissures that can take some water and bring it down to the groundwater, but there are also enlarged cracks and fissures that concentrate infiltrating waters and bring it to the subsurface much, much quicker. Based on that, a model structure was developed, that looks quite similar, and it's actually on purpose. It's the model structure that I developed with my colleagues was based on the understanding of how this system or a door line works. We tried to keep it very simple, and simple means in that case it was a model with only 4 parameters that expressed the soil thickness, the epikarst thickness, the epikarst hydraulic conductivity, and a spatial heterogeneity constant that is more or less determining the shape of this distribution of soil thickness and epikarst thickness. This model was applied on a grid over entire Europe. So this red frame here would be applied to each of these different grid cells, and determined by the input data of the model, which I will show in the next slide, we chose a grid resolution of 0.5 decimal degrees, which is more or less 25 plus minus 2 kilometers. So I come straight to the results. I don't want to get lost in all the parameterization things. We used a 10-year period of daily information on rainfall and potential evapotranspiration data. This data was derived from the Priestley-Taylor equation, but from meteorological variables that we all got, including the precipitation from the global land surface data assimilation system. It's a global freely available data set that is used to run models, or it's used to other, for other interpretations. We run it through this simple model, and we got recharge simulations, here expressed by millimeters per year over this 10-year period from 2002 to 2012. Here, I also show the recharge rate, which is the fraction of precipitation that becomes recharge. It's easier to interpret, so dark blue means 100% of precipitation becomes groundwater recharge. Dark red means 0% of precipitation becomes groundwater recharge. And you can see that it slightly resembles the precipitation patterns, but you can also see that the more you go south, the less groundwater recharge takes actually place. And if you go to Ireland or to Scotland, of course, there's not much evapotranspiration, so everything goes sooner or later into the subsurface. Because it was a simple model, and because it's operating on a scale that large, it was urgent to also quantify the uncertainty of the simulations. This is shown here. This is the standard deviation of groundwater recharge, the standard deviation of these simulations that is derived from the uncertainty of determining the model parameters. This is the same thing, but expressed as a coefficient of variation. So it's a standard deviation divided by the mean recharge. And here you can actually see that there are some differences in terms of precision of the model. So also the more you go south, the higher uncertainty you get. Uncertainties larger than 50% can take place, because here the south evaporation becomes much more important, and if you don't get the evaporation right, the model will be wrong, and this is one of the weak spots of them. Anyway, we thought the precision that we obtain here is quite not so bad. So it was also worth to take a look at the accuracy. So it means how close are these simulations actually to observed values. This is shown here. Don't be confused. This is the same model. It's just a different way of showing it. I just used a different layout because I wanted to compare that model with a typically applied large-scale model that does not account for any karstic processes. It's the PCR Globe WB model. Maybe some of you know it from other publications. They have a lot of nature science publications. All this crazy stuff is done by that model. And here in this graph, you see observed recharge values. Observed didn't mean that we observed them ourselves, but we extracted that from a literature review. So each of these points is actually a tracer study, a water balance study. It could be even a local modeling study, but of course with a higher precision because they work on a smaller scale. And on the y-axis, you see in blue the simulations of the karst large-scale model, and in orange simulations of the non-karstic model. And first of all, you see there's a big spread, so of course the models are not as precise as you would expect a model to work on a catchment or aquifer scale, but you can also see that there's a systematic underestimation of the non-karstic model because it cannot account for concentrated recharge processes. What the model does, the PCR globe model, if you have a lot of precipitation and everything is saturated in the soil, it will produce large volumes of surface runoff, while this model can take much more groundwater recharge or infiltration because of the heterogeneity of infiltration capacities that is included there. We also changed the parameters of this model, in particular the distribution coefficient, to make this a homogeneous model. And when we did that, we actually came pretty close to this very complex physically based global model. And so we could also provide some evidence that quantification or the heterogeneity in this model is actually causing the differences among these two models. Okay, so precision is okay, accuracy is at least better than other approaches, so we could go for some application. This is one of the first applications, which was published in 2017. It's again the same research simulation domain, just a different color code, separated into humid karst regions in green, mountain karst regions in blue, Mediterranean regions in violet, and desert regions in dark yellow. This was done by a clustering scheme, but the results were quite similar to a Köppen-Geiger classification. What we see is actually that the tendencies predicted by the karst model and by the non-karstic model, which is the PCR Globe WB model, are quite similar. They both predict decrease, and the decrease is sometimes a little bit apart, but for example, the Mediterranean, they are quite similar, just 10% of difference. But in terms of absolute values, we can see that the differences among the models, which is due to the consideration or non-consideration of preferential recharge processes, prevails until the end of the century. What's also interesting, I didn't speak much about the parameterization scheme, but you may remember the locations of the different FluxNet and ISMN stations, so the observations that we used for the model. We had much more observations available in the north, so in the mountain and in the humid regions. We had few observations available in the Mediterranean, and actually no observations in the desert region. And these little dashed lines, they quantify the parameter uncertainty of the model simulation at those different regions. And as expected, in those regions where we had a lot of observations, in the humid region and in the mountain regions, you get very narrow uncertainty bands. In the Mediterranean, they get wider, but the predicted change is still larger than the uncertainty. And when you go to the desert regions, the yellow dashed lines, I don't know if you see them, but it's ending here and it's ending here. They are much larger than the predicted change. So in this case, my model is so uncertain that I cannot make any conclusions about whether there will be a real change or decrease of 7% or not. Anyway, for those regions, we could conclude that there will be a decrease of annual recharge due to changes of precipitation and increase of temperature. Standard models or traditional approaches would underestimate the total available volume of groundwater, giving a potentially surplus of available drinking water of 1 to 3,300 cubic meters per year per capita. This has to be taken with a lot of care because this water might leave the system as quickly as it enters the system, and since it enters the system that quickly, it might be also strongly polluted. So it doesn't mean that karst regions have more drinking water. Another application was actually something really crazy, which came up with colleagues that work on paleoclimate reconstruction using the stable isotope oxygen 18. This is a study that looked at the differences of isotopic composition of the rain and the isotopic composition of drips in karstic caves across the globe. The model is only available in Europe, so we only look at Europe in this case. And these colleagues, they found that you have a bias of drip and rainfall water when you plot them against each other, even considering the volume of rainfall. So if this volume-weighted rainfall water, this down here, amount-weighted precipitation against drip water. This might be very obvious for somebody who's working on hydrology or critical zone processes, but for the paleoclimatic community, they had, for the last couple of years, all these interpretations from oxygen 18 were actually based on the assumption that precipitation and the drip rates in the cave have the same isotopic composition. And this study was the first that showed on a larger scale that actually there is a big bias, and using the large-scale continental model, which was set up with information from completely other locations, we could actually correct quite well the drip water composition by using recharge-weighted input instead of precipitation amount-weighted input. So that was another application, which is maybe a bit particular, but it was really exciting because I usually don't do stuff like that. Yeah, we could come up with this correction. So after that, I got approached from many hydrologists or hydrogeologists that work on water resources and also on paleoclimate reconstruction to provide that information not only in Europe but on the entire globe. And I tried to do the same, or I began to do the same thing. So we tried to include the same modeling approach, same input data set for precipitation, same simulation period, and same estimation to obtain evapotranspiration and a quantification of uncertainty. And this is how it looks. So it looks very similar, but when you look a little bit closer into the uncertainty, you will see that this is the uncertainty that I showed you before for the continental model, where we had a lot of observation. This is now the same model, but not using the observations that we have here, and the uncertainties, they almost explode. So the red areas mean that there's 100% or even more, sorry, I forgot the sign, even more uncertainty down here. So these values don't say anything. And just at regions where we have a lot of precipitation and just little evapotranspiration, the uncertainties remain a bit small. Before somebody asks why these maps are a little bit different, this is the cast map from Paul Williams that he produced some decades ago in Auckland, and this is the New World Cast map that was published between those two publications. So that is a more recent estimate, and that's why they are a little bit different. So looking at the uncertainty on a global scale, we see that we get these red areas with very high uncertainty in almost every part of the world, and mostly in those regions where there's high evaporation, and even a 50% of uncertainty, which is indicated by the yellow areas. It's actually something that you don't want to base your water management plans on. So that brings us now back from the modeling to the critical zone observations, because this uncertainty can only be reduced if the modeling concepts improve and if more data is actually included into the model development and evaluation procedure. So what I can do anyway, I could use, again, the FluxNet and International Soil Moisture Network Station data, this time across the entire globe. So you see there are actually also observations available in a high density in the United States, but also in other parts of the world. There are some few stations. The problem is these are just point observations, and they do not contain any information about the impact of different land covers that all persist in these different regions, and they also do not provide any information about heterogeneity. So if I have one soil moisture profile, I do not know if this is representative for this particular point or not. So this, for evaluating and improving hydrological model, is actually not very satisfactory. And that brings in what I'm doing right now with my group. We set up a global soil moisture monitoring program with 5 sites located at 5 different climatic regions. One of them in the wet United Kingdom, one of them in the mountains, the Alps in southern Germany, one of them in the Mediterranean Spain, another one in the tropical coast of Puerto Rico, and then one of them in the semi-arid, arid regions just at the beginning of the outback in New South Wales in Australia. Both sides, grassland and forest land cover types were considered. And I will just show you later how we did this and how we spread these 500 soil moisture probes in these different regions. But first I want to show you how they actually look. So this is our Spanish site. And somewhere between those rocks you will find our probes actually close to this little tree. And in this forest we have our forest plot. This is in the UK. It's the area is called Sheep Drove Organic Farm. So there are usually a lot of sheep in this time not. It's maybe the only sunny day in the year, but we were pretty lucky. And our soil moisture probes are actually back in this forest, so it's a bit far away from our grassland plot. This is in Australia. The brown thing, that's grass, but it's not green. And there are some trees, it's usually full of kangaroos, and that's why we had to build a fence. So maybe you see the fence sticks here, because the kangaroos were vandalizing all the time. This is in Puerto Rico. So these are just the two summits of two karstic tower karst mountains that begin here and begin here. One of our study sites is down here in the grassland, and the other one is on the mountain on the left. And this is our German side with a little bit of snow, where we have our site just here in this hill slope and beside the hill slope in the forest. So you see, like, this is really mountain, this is really tropics, this is really dry, this is really... okay, no, this is not original UK, but imagine rain. And this is quite typical for the Mediterranean area. And to get an impression about the subsurface heterogeneity, we defined in the forest and in the grassland 20 by 20 meter plots and randomly sampled 15 locations for soil moisture profiles within these different plots. And they are shown down here. So basically you have like these axes, 20 meter here, 20 meter here. Mostly we try to make them as parallel as possible, as you can see here. So this is Spanish side, this is the little tree that I showed you before, and this is the area we have where we have our grassland probes, and this is in the forest. We try to get the same slope and exposure to the sun, so that many things are at least a little bit comparable. And then we just sampled 15 different points inside this coordinate system that we could develop there. And all these different lines, they actually connect our soil moisture profiles with different distribution boxes, and at the end with one box that contains from 2 up to 4 loggers that can run for, we tested them like for almost 3 to 5 or 6 months. In these profiles, we planted 3 different soil moisture probes. One of them, okay, this is actually not, that's actually not a good example, because usually we have at 5 centimeters, then we have at 10 centimeters, and then we have one of them just when the rock begins. And in Spain, the rock began at around 40 centimeters, plus minus 20 centimeters. So we tried to get the upper part of the epikarst, where actually hydraulic conductivities are expected to increase again. And yes, we run all these probes at a 15-minute resolution to get an idea of the reaction after rainfall events. And yeah, as I said before, it's in total. We had 450 probes available, but sometimes the soil was so thin that we couldn't install all 3 of them, so some of them are left as spare material. These are the first results. So we started with the installation in 2018, so that's why most of the time just begin here. You see on the rows, they represent the different locations: Puerto Rico, Spain, United Kingdom, Germany, and Australia. Left side is forest, right side is grassland. On top, that's the precipitation that we measured at all these sites. And in gray, you see all the soil moisture probes. In red, you see the mean value. So we do not, in this figure, we do not distinguish between the deep and the shallow probes. What we see at the first glance, so this is just preliminary analysis, see that there are quite some differences among the sites. So for example, in Australia, as you can expect, there is very low soil moisture, considering individual probes or the mean soil moisture content. And in fact, we have a cave below one of these sites, below the grassland site, and with some drip rate loggers below the speleothemes. And within the 2 years of measurement, we only had 1 recharge event. And then there was, again, the drought and the fires. Fortunately, the fires did not hit our sites, so my probes are not burned and they're still there. But it's generally very, very dry in that region. When you look at the United Kingdom, we actually don't see so many peaks, and we see that there's quite a very seasonal signal with higher soil moisture content in winter and lower soil moisture content in summer. Also, we see different dynamics in terms of land covers. This is most pronounced in Puerto Rico, where we have a very thick and loamy soil at the grassland, which is it's basically a doorline that is filled with like a lot of sediments, and in the forest, it's basically a complete forest covers with roots that are connected to each other and holding each other, and below the roots there's just little soil and directly the rock. So basically when there's a rainfall event, you have everything that is not like taken by the roots immediately, it will infiltrate into the carbonate rock. We also found different heterogeneities. So in the German side, we found a very widespread of observed soil moisture content. Also in the Puerto Rican side, it's much less in Australia or in Spain or the United Kingdom. So these are the first results. We also came up with some like very preliminary interpretations with a very simple approach. These are again the same data, just expressed as box plots for the grassland and for the forest side on top. And here you see again Puerto Rico, Spain, UK, Germany, and Australia. So this is the same time series, but now also over time, summarized over time. And we just looked at values that exceed a soil water content over 35 to 65%, because we said a loamy soil cannot hold more than around 50% plus minus something of water. And if there's more, there would be groundwater recharge taking place if it continues to rain. And when we look at like the 35% line is more or less down here, we see that in Puerto Rico, in the grassland, in Germany, we get quite a large fraction exceeding this value. So we can be quite sure that in this area somewhere recharge would initiate, also in Puerto Rico. But for the UK, that was quite surprising. We see a similar variability compared to Spain, which I thought it's not possible, but it is. And what else? Yeah, and for Australia, we see again what we saw before. So there is mostly everything is below this threshold. So these few points that came close to this soil water content of 35 to 65%, these might have been those that actually produced recharge. The reason why we find more recharge in Germany, for example, is of course the weather. So this is a photo that I took in early 2019. You remember that was a very cold winter. So this down here, this is our logger. There was in fact 2.5 meters of snow on top of the logger, and this all infiltrated in spring into the aquifer. When we look at Australia again, okay, it's more or less the same figure. You can imagine that it's really dry. So the most dominant control that we right now are sure is the rain, but we are still not sure which errors we make because of the different effective porosities of the soil, because we know in Puerto Rico actually recharge in the forest must be as significant as the recharge from the grassland, because the soil just doesn't hold the water. So coming back to the question how we can use observations like that to improve groundwater recharge modeling in past regions. First of all, the information that we are collecting right now, and that our colleagues that are collecting similar information, we can use this to improve the conceptual understanding of the processes themselves and develop better model structures. This might be an example. It's a further development of this 4-parameter model that includes different land use types and also the routing depths. This is by a former PhD student, Fanny Sarrazin, who's now at UFZ in Germany. So we could use the understanding that we gain now at these different forest and grassland sites to test and improve models like that. What we found and learned in the Puerto Rican forest is that actually the assumption that recharge in karst only takes place after saturation of the loamy soil is actually not true when you look at dense root networks without much soil and high temperatures with not a lot of weathering in the rock. So actually we have to think if sometimes a model structure that initiates recharge with a linear relationship to soil moisture instead of a saturation excess recharge simulation might be more adequate in some regions. Also, if there is a model available, an improved model, you can directly use these observations to calibrate or to evaluate the model simulations. Because to simulate groundwater recharge, to simulate the critical zone, we have to reflect the dynamics of soil moisture. And also, the soil moisture data to simulate groundwater recharge could be evaluated by additional observations that we have at our karstic sites. Most of them also have a spring or a river that is fed by the aquifer, so we can actually get some additional independent observations to evaluate our groundwater recharge estimates based on soil moisture. Fortunately, I'm not alone to do that, so many of the results that I showed you were actually done by my PhD student Romain Berthelin and all the others of my team. So maybe some of you know Tunde. He's the first author of the global karst spring discharge database that was just published in Nature Scientific Data, and all the others will publish very interesting results very soon. So merci pour votre attention, and I hope you have nice questions.
Thank you, Andreas. So, do you have questions for Andreas? Not you first.
Thank you. Just a technical question. When you compute efficient rainfall, which is more or less rainfall minus evapotranspiration, what is the time step you use to compute?
Okay. In this case, it was a daily time step. But when we developed this new vegetation model that I showed on my last slide, thank you. Test. Yeah. We actually got into some discussion with a reviewer who said, yeah, we have to consider the diurnal variation of evapotranspiration, and we did some test runs with the model on an hourly basis. We found that the results are a little bit different, but if you are interested in groundwater recharge, they do not matter so much. If you're interested in how plants take up the nutrients, it might be more important, but for the groundwater recharge, it's just slightly worse. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for your nice speech. I am wondering if the beautiful network of soil moisture monitoring you implemented was just for 1 year, or do you have opportunities to continue for the long term such monitoring?
Okay, so the project provides funding for 3 years of measurement. So following the project plan, I was supposed to install it at the first half year of the thesis of my PhD student and then run it until the end and a little bit longer. Of course, as you know, fieldwork, it took a bit longer and a lot of problems came up. We had to replace parts. So, in fact, it started a little bit later, but I hope that I can run the probes at least for the entire duration of the project, which is 5 years long, so longer than the PhD thesis. And actually, like in Puerto Rico and in the UK, the recovery of the soil was pretty fast. So you didn't see any of our disturbances that we created after 3 or 4 months. But in Australia or in Spain, it took quite a bit. In Australia, nothing changed. It's still like you still see the disturbances. And in Spain, it takes really long to get conditions that are close to natural conditions. So it would be a shame to take them out now. And I will surely try to get additional funding to come up with new research questions, maybe get another PhD student, convince funding agency that now there's a low risk of failure of the experimental network because it's already there and it's working pretty well. So I hope I can do it longer. Yeah.
So thank you very much for your very interesting talk, clearly showing the relations between soil moisture and groundwater recharge. I was surprised, and I think many of us were surprised to see that the soil moisture was so low in Puerto Rico. Yes. And you say that this is due to the fast drainage of the soils. Can you tell us a little bit more about the characteristics of these soils? Are there oxysoils?
I'm not a soil scientist, so I don't want to say exactly.
That's a pity.
I can. I'm really. Maybe I can learn, but I can describe how it looks there. So in the mountain, you have a lot of big and small trees. Like actually, they are not as big as in the valleys because of the storms that come through. So it's a different type of species. I can look up the name of the species. But when you look at the ground, you basically only see a lot of litter and roots. And when we actually connected the probes and the loggers, the easiest way to insert the probes into the ground was actually not digging a hole, but just moving the roots aside and putting it in. It was so soft and so open that it's actually just organic matter, roots and litter. And sometimes in like little depressions in the slope, you find a little bit of loamy soil. But mostly it was like when somebody, fortunately there are no animals, but if somebody actually stumbles over a cable, they will pull out easily the entire profile. So maybe the word soil is not completely right. It's organic horizon. Maybe that's the right expression.
This is a soil, even if it's organic.
All right. But yes, so it's the voids and the porosities are so high that like only water attached to the roots can stay there. And I guess the vegetation adapted to that, so they will take the water when it comes through, and everything else, you don't see any surface runoff. It goes into the rock, and there's a spring at the bottom which actually feeds the landowner's house, so we know where the water's coming out to, and we have some probes there. Yeah, you're welcome.
He is our soil scientist.
Yes. That's a surprise.
the only one in the room.
Okay.
Other questions? Yeah. Matt, can you?
Yeah, I was curious about the parameterization of the model, and
Yes.
specifically this parameter that's controlling how much heterogeneity you have
Yes.
and how you're distributing this recharge. Are you adjusting that differently for different karst settings, or is it something that's a global parameter that's fixed?
At the moment, we use a separate parameterization of the model for these 4 different karst regions that we defined before. Like we have a special parameter set for the humid region, another one for the Mediterranean region, for the mountain and for the desert region. And we partially use a priori information, for example, about soil thicknesses that we get from global maps, from FAO, for example. But the rest is something similar to an inverse calibration, but not going to an optimum value, because then we would basically calibrate out the errors that we have because of the scales and because of the simplifications. Instead, we use very low criteria. For example, we were content with a positive correlation of monthly soil moisture dynamics to not cut out good simulations that just appear to be bad because of the problems of scale and simplification. So, and that's how we end up not with just one simulation for each of these subregions, but hundreds of simulations that fulfill these very soft criteria. And that's how we can quantify the uncertainty, and that's why uncertainty gets larger when you go to regions where there are less information.
Any other question? So.
Andreas, Germany is known to have a huge cosmic ray network to monitor soil moisture. Are you not using this facility?
Not yet, but my strategy for this global network was actually to attach myself to ongoing research projects, because only that way I could ensure that somebody is actually taking care of the probes and somebody is also interested in the data. So my colleagues in the UK, they have on the grassland side and on the forest side, there's a cosmic ray probe, and they want to use the data as ground data to check the measurements that they get from the cosmic ray measurements. And in fact, that is one plan to prolong the measurement period in the United Kingdom, that we can show how useful our observations are and maybe develop a new project proposal with that. And maybe even plant the cosmic ray probes at the other 4 sites. That would be great. Yes.
Thank you. Tu as une annonce à faire?
So, any more questions? So I think we can thank Andreas again.